After the German failure at Kursk, even Hitler had at last begun to realize that it was now impossible to inflict a serious defeat on the Russians. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, Hitler did believe that a well-executed offensive in the West could defeat the Western Allies and free up much-needed forces for the East to at least try and halt the Russian advances. With his planned Western offensive, he believed that he could force the Allies to sue for peace from a stalemate position. But even Hitler must have known that this was the last chance for the panzers.
The basic reason for the Ardennes offensive was that in late 1944, Germany was obviously facing defeat within a measurable period of time. In the west, the British and American forces were closing up on the Rhine, and in the east, the Russians were poised to invade East Germany and flood on into Berlin.
Hitler decided that he needed to sustain the war, and the one way was to counter-offensive in the west and try and split the armies in the west, and then hopefully we would sue for peace, and then he could turn all his attention through to Russia. This resulted in a battle in the Ardennes, which is quite commonly known as the Battle of the Bulge.
By a small miracle of logistics, the hard-pressed Germans of the Third Reich somehow managed to scrape together the men and machines for one last great offensive. In the middle of December 1944, Hitler launched his surprise winter offensive in the Ardennes region of Belgium. For this offensive, 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks and armored vehicles had somehow been assembled. After the destructive battles through France in the summer, this force represented the very last reserves of manpower. Hitler placed all of his hopes on this, the last great offensive in the West during World War II.
The Ardennes offensive was Hitler's last gamble, because he committed all of his forces in the West, the entire armies and air forces, to the Ardennes offensive. And if that offensive failed, he had no reserves, and there was nothing to stop the Allies going into Germany.
The plan for the attack was fairly straightforward. The Ardennes region provided a successful launchpad for the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940. Once again, Hitler planned to push a strong armour-led thrust through the Allied-held positions and on to Antwerp.
The Ardennes offensive, or as the Germans called it, the von Rundstedt offensive, as the Americans called it, the Battle of the Bulge. The idea of this offensive was to split the Allied forces, the British and the Canadians in the north and the Americans in the south, split the Allied forces and aim for the port of Antwerp, which was by then the main port for the supplies for the Allied armies. It would achieve several objectives. It would cut off the supplies to the Allied armies. It would also split the Allied armies, and the Germans were well aware of the personality conflicts and clashes between the various Allied commanders, and they thought that this would help. And they also thought that as they'd done it in 1940 and surprised the French by going through the Ardennes, they could do it in 1944.
Unlike 1940, however, the Germans were fighting an army who were used to their tactics. This time the Allies had better equipped forces that they could call upon to meet any threat. The terrain and supply problems did not favor the Germans this time either. The German generals could see the shortcomings of the offensive, but at this late stage in the war, few of them dared to question Hitler's authority for fear of their lives.
There was perhaps some possibility of success for the Ardennes offensive, but it was a gambler's throw. Hitler was relying very much upon surprise, upon the hope that the winter weather would prevent Allied aircraft from taking to the air and interfering, that they would capture Allied fuel supplies to fuel the drive on. However, he did have 100 miles to go to Antwerp, and his generals rather thought that it might be better to go for a shorter victory to try to pin the Allied armies against the line of the River Meuse, about halfway towards Antwerp. He was risking, however, a lot upon surprise and upon the superiority and the fanaticism of his tank crews and infantry.
The Germans had been busy in developing new tanks and assault gun designs during this period. One of the most significant new designs was the Tiger II-B, or King Tiger. This tank weighed 68 tons and was manned by 5 crew members. The main armament was the dauntingly high-velocity 88mm L-71 cannon. This was backed up with 2 7.92mm machine guns. The armor protection was formidable, and the top speed was a respectable 24 miles an hour.
By 1944, and at the end of 1944, German tank design had responded to the designs put forward by the Russians of the IS-2, and they had developed what is known as the King Tiger, or Tiger B. This was a very impressive vehicle. If it was used today, it would still be a very impressive vehicle. It had a very large gun, much larger than a normal Tiger. It was still an 88, but much longer. It had sloping armour, very similar to the Panther, but in a much bigger design. They only ever built around about 470 of these vehicles, but they were unfortunately only used in small quantities, and probably only 70 at any one time were available for use.
The King Tiger was ordered after Hitler demanded a tank that could mount the massively powerful L-71 main gun. Even the mighty Tiger I was unable to do this, so in January 1943, the order was placed for the new machine. The first vehicles came off the production line a year later.
Heavier tanks became necessary during the Second World War for all of the combatants, and the reason was that it was found that in combat, survival depended upon having a good big gun and lots of armour. If you had those, you could survive, but tanks that were more thinly skinned perished quite quickly.
The first 50 King Tigers were fitted with a turret made by Porsche, who were later to become famous for rather different reasons. The remaining 439 Tiger IIs were fitted with the Henschel turret. The Porsche turrets were originally built for a Porsche design of the Tiger I. When this contract was unexpectedly awarded elsewhere, Porsche had already completed 50 turrets, and they were found to be large enough to accommodate the larger gun. The sole remaining example of this type can be found in the Tank Museum in Bovington.
This is the Sonderkraftzug 182, better known as the King Tiger. It really represents the absolute limits of tank design in World War II. In some respects, we've actually passed the limits, because at 75 tons, this vehicle really is too heavy for the suspension that's intended to take it and for the engine that's designed to drive it along. But it does have a number of features that you would see in post-war tanks. And as you can see, the lessons of World War II tank fighting had been incorporated into the Tiger II, because in addition to having this enormous thickness of armour, which is 180 millimetres thick, it's also sloped, so it was designed to deflect shots away from the vehicle, and that's what happened in practice. So in that respect, Germany had come very close to producing the ultimate machine on the battlefield. But that's all they'd done. They'd come close because it had so many disadvantages that it completely outweighed the advantages it had.
The first time that King Tigers saw action was during the Allied invasion of France in June 1944. Around 15 King Tigers were involved in these battles. A full battalion of 45 King Tigers was later sent to the Arnhem area in September 1944. They helped to ensure that the Allied Market Garden operation was thwarted. They were next to feature in the coming German offensive in the Ardennes. Like the Tiger I, this tank was better suited to the open country, and the majority of them were sent east to battle with the advancing Russians. A full battalion of 45 tanks was earmarked for the assault. The SS 501st Heavy Tank Battalion, which was part of the 6th Panzer Army, was placed with Kampfgruppe Piper at the front of the armoured advance.
The spearhead of the Ardennes offensive was the King Tiger tank, which was the first time it was used en masse. The problem was that the King Tiger was too heavy, too large and too cumbersome to get through the very narrow valleys and through the forests that comprise the Ardennes.
Now, it may have been formidable on the battlefield, but there were a number of problems with regard to getting this thing into action. They were massively prone to breakdown. They were very difficult to keep running. The other thing that was likely to happen with the complete control of the air that the Allies had was that the Germans were unable to bring forward sufficient fuel to keep a beast like this running.
Besides tanks, the German forces had also come to rely upon turretless tank destroyers, which sacrificed the tank turrets in return for the ability to mount a bigger gun and better armour. They were also easier and cheaper to produce under the difficult conditions which the Germans now faced. They were also ideally suited for defensive warfare. By late 1944, the assault guns and tank destroyers had become a valuable addition to the German arsenal. Following on from earlier tank destroyer designs, the chassis of the King Tiger was adapted to create a new heavy tank destroyer, the Jagdtiger. The resulting monster weighed in at 70 tons and required a 6-man crew. The main armament was the massively powerful 128mm cannon, which fired a shell of such high velocity that it could blow apart any Allied tank by the massive power of the kinetic energy in the solid metal shell. The armor protection was a colossal 250mm thick. The speed of this machine was similar to the King Tiger, at 24 miles an hour. For close defense, the Jagdtiger was equipped with 2 machine guns. One of these was the familiar MG-34. The other was the new MG-42, which quickly became a much feared weapon amongst the Allies due to its high rate of fire.
This is the Jagdtiger. It was the hunting version of the King Tiger, and this was the largest armoured vehicle to see service in World War II. Up above us here we have the 128mm anti-tank gun, which was big enough to destroy any tank at almost any range that it could see or hit the target. It was hugely armoured with this great metal box on top of the King Tiger chassis. Only 70 or 80 of these machines saw action in their own heavy tank battalion in the Ardennes campaign.
The Jagd Tiger was a highly effective tank destroyer, but only a total of 70 Tiger II chassis were ever converted to the new design. This was enough to equip 2 heavy tank destroyer units. One of these, the 653rd, saw action during the Ardennes offensive. This very imposing machine was more suited to the open country and not the close confines of the Ardennes. The overstressed engine and transmission did provide the crews with a few problems.
It was almost impossible to maintain. It had been designed and built in such short time scales that there wasn't really time to test them properly. If they had been tested properly, I think it would have been quickly proved that these things were well beyond the limit of the engine to drive it, and the suspension to bear it, and the tracks to carry it around. It suffered from all of the problems of the Tiger II in terms of being able to negotiate villages. In addition, it was so large you couldn't really conceal it on the battlefield, so it was designed to stand there as a kind of a semi-mobile pillbox. It would take up a position, it would engage the Allied tanks at the longest possible range, because with this gun we really had no answer to a machine like the Jagd Tiger, and its only hope was to keep the Allied tanks at a sufficient distance that it could destroy them at a range before they could get close enough to fire their own guns.
Overall, this vehicle was an excellent destroyer of Allied tanks. But its introduction was too late in the war and the numbers too few to have any effect on the final outcome. The manufacture of assault guns was more cost-effective, and these types increasingly proved their worth on the battlefield. More and more resources were put into developing new designs, and the trend was not always to larger machines.
One vehicle which was produced in rather large numbers was a vehicle called the Hetzer. Now the Hetzer was a very, very small vehicle, but with a very large gun, and was actually probably one of the finest vehicles the Germans had used.
The Hetzer, in contrast to the 70 tons of the Jagd Tiger, only weighed 16 tons and carried a 4-man crew in its interior. Despite its small size, it packed a punch as it was armed with a powerful 75mm L48 gun. It had a single 7.92mm machine gun for close quarter fighting. The armour protection was 60mm thick, but being of the sloped design actually increased the protective capabilities. The top speed was 26 miles an hour.
By the middle to late 1944, the German had developed their tank destroyer fleet into a vehicle very similar to the one behind. This is a Hetzer light tank destroyer based on the 38T tank chassis. It had become obsolete. Rather than discard it, they used it, adapted it, and this is what you got. It uses a 75mm gun, which you could not put in the old 38T because it was not capable of taking that size gun. So you build a tank destroyer. They learnt the lessons from the T-34. As you can see, sloping armour. That increases the armour protection. The vehicle has a very low silhouette, but the same drawback as you got with Su-100s and the other tank destroyers. The gun has got the very limited traverse, so you have to move the vehicle. That is all right when you're attacking, because you're moving forward and you can be seen. But if you're in a defensive position, the movement would actually show your position.
Another assault gun design that was used by the Germans during the Ardennes offensive was the Jagdpanzer IV Lang. This vehicle was based on the Panzer IV chassis and weighed around 26 tons. the crew contained 4 men. Its main armament was the very potent 75mm L-70 main gun. This was the same gun that was used on the Panther. One MG-42 machine gun provided the close-quarter support. Armor protection was 80mm thick. Top speed was 24 miles an hour. This vehicle silhouette, and together with the very effective main gun, made this machine a very capable killer. These new tank designs joined the existing German machines, including the Panzer IV, Panther, and Tiger. On the whole, the German tanks were probably superior to the Allies, who still relied on the Sherman.
Well, here is the only other tank in the world which equaled the production figures of the T-34, and that's the American Sherman. Again, about 45,000 were built at different marks, just like the Russian, and it was all around a very good tank, but its success is mainly because of the quantity it was produced in. The American enemies just couldn't match that sort of thing. These early Shermans, they're fitted with a 75mm gun, but not very long, as you can see, which means it hasn't got a high starting velocity of the shell. But it was changed later, and especially the latest Shermans in the end had the famous British 17-pounder, which was as good as the German 88. In places probably even better, with a tungsten shell in it. On top, of course, you got a heavy machine gun as well. And otherwise, as are most tanks, the bow machine gun, here next to the driver, the coaxial one next to the gun, you see sticking out there, and then a very heavy one on the top. And later, as well, you had anti-aircraft machine guns for defense against low-flying aeroplanes.
The Ardennes offensive was given the codename Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine. Hitler had envisaged a repeat of his great victory in the summer of 1940, which knocked France out of the war. But the situation in December 1944 was very different to May 1940. For one, the planned route for the new offensive cut straight across the Ardennes. In 1940, the route used had travelled in a southwesterly direction and utilised the road system that generally ran in that direction also.
The strike of the roads, the run of the roads, follows, of course, the valley bottoms, and the valley bottoms run southwesterly. However, the Germans wanted to strike, to get to Antwerp, northwesterly. So they were striking across the grain of the countryside, across the grain of the road system. That would mean difficulties when they were trying to plan a fast, mobile offensive using tanks.
The Ardennes is a very thickly forested area. The roads, certainly in 1944 and even today, are very narrow roads, very steep roads. There's lots of areas in which they can be ambushed. For example, on a very narrow road, one anti-tank gun knocks out the first tank, nothing can get past it. And this is one of the problems that the Germans faced.
Another restrictive feature of the planning was the lack of sufficient fuel.
By late 1944, the Germans were desperately short of fuel. All of their fuel came from the Romanian oil fields, which by that time were either in the hands of the Russians or were being overrun by the Russians. The only fuel that they could produce was synthetic fuel, which was produced from coal. And so part of the overall planning for the Ardennes offensive was that the German forces, the Panzer forces in the advance, would capture and use American fuel stocks. As we know, the Americans actually destroyed those fuel stocks.
The fuel factor on its own was to play a significant part in the eventual failure of the operation. The deployment of the forces was not best suited to ensure success either. The advance towards Antwerp required the forces to swing northeast after the Germans had reached the Meuse River. Given that the Allies had strong forces in Belgium and Holland, it was suspected that they would eventually mount a counterattack into the German left flank. However, the strongest armoured German forces were situated on the right flank and too far removed to meet any potential threat. The Germans did have some elements in their favour.
In the Ardennes, the Americans had weak forces that were there for rest and recuperation, or there were units that had been badly mauled in the fighting and they were there it was a quiet part of the line, and that was another reason why the Germans attacked.
The other point is, of course, it's unpleasant fighting conditions. This is December 1944. It's cold, rain, sleet, very difficult conditions for fighting in. The Germans, of course, were rather more accustomed to this given their experience on the Eastern Front, and so Hitler may well have thought that that was a gain for them. He was also, of course, hoping that the weather would keep the Allied air forces at bay.
The much-feared Yarbos, or rocket-firing planes, struck fear into the heart of every German soldier. The poor weather situation prevalent in the middle of December 1944 would keep the Allied planes on the ground for the vital opening phases of the attack. This would hopefully allow the advance to make a good start and reach some of the objectives. When the attack began, the scale of the German forces unleashed surprised the Allied commanders. Some of them had suspected a German attack around this time, but not to this extent. Some of the forces that were part of the German attack had been severely mauled during the Normandy battles. The planned area of attack was also being held by Allied troops who themselves had only recently been involved in heavy fighting around the Hürtgen forest. Hitler was confident of success and did not allow any alterations to his plans. By the 16th of December, everything was in place. The quiet Ardennes sector was about to erupt with the sound of battle. The panzers were once again moving west. The Germans had assembled an impressive lineup of tank forces for the offensive. The powerful 6th Panzer Army were positioned in the north under Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich. This force included the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, 9th SS Hitler Panzer Division Hohenstaufen, and the 12th SS Panzer Division. Their task was to advance along the route from their forming up area near Dahlem in Germany and into Belgium, around the town of Lochheim. Their objective was to cross the Meuse River just below Liège and advance onto Antwerp. Just to the south of this force was the 5th Panzer Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Hasso von Manteuffel. He had the 2nd Panzer, 9th Panzer, 116th Panzer, and the Panzer Lehr divisions, together with the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. Their objective was to move from Prüm in Germany and onto Antwerp via Brussels. The 7th Army, under General Erich Bradenberger, was to take the southernmost route into Luxembourg. This was the infantry-only formation, made up from the 5th Infantry Divisions, including a better halved parachute division. They were to move from Bitburg in Germany and into the area held by the US 3rd Army with the objective of tying down these forces. All these forces were part of Army Group B, commanded by Field Marshal Model. They had very limited reserves in the shape of the 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division and the Führer Begleit Brigade and the Führer Grenadier Brigade. This total force had 2,000 artillery pieces, over 1,000 tanks and assault guns, and 250,000 men. To have assembled this impressive force after the destructive battles in Normandy and the East was an exceptional feat on its own.
Hitler recognized that the greatest factor that would operate to the German advantage would be surprise. No commanders were to travel with copies of the plan if they were going to go by air. There was to be no radio traffic concerning the plan. All communications were to be by hand, personally delivered, and if necessary, destroyed afterwards. Knowledge of the plan was kept on a very strict need-to-know basis. Then, as far as the movement of forces was concerned, movement was at night only in order to avoid Allied air reconnaissance. There were strict instructions about camouflage, so very strict precautions to achieve surprise.
The storm was about to break on just 4 infantry divisions, who were part of the US 5th Corps under Major General Gerau. 2 were positioned opposite the 6th Panzer Army. Facing Manteuffel in the center were the 28th and 106th Infantry Divisions, who were part of Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps. In the south, facing Brandenberger's men, were the 9th Armoured and the 4th Infantry Divisions. All of these American units had recently been involved in heavy fighting and were in the area for a rest. They totaled around 80,000 men, less than 450 tanks and assault guns, and around 400 artillery pieces. Although initially outnumbered, the Allies had strong forces positioned close by, including Patton's 3rd Army, that could be called upon to back up the defenses in this area. On the morning of the 16th of December, the German artillery opened fire along the entire front line. The object of this was to confuse the enemy, disrupt their lines of communication, and open gaps in the lines. Due to the extreme secrecy beforehand, the Germans were unable to identify the Allied positions in advance. The result was that the German bombardment had limited success. It did sever Allied lines of communication, inflict some casualties, and provide some confusion, but not to the extent that was hoped for by the Germans. In the north, Dietrich's forces advanced towards Elsenborn Ridge. A German parachute drop had been ordered for this area, with the objective of capturing a vital road junction in the Baraque Michel. This drop did not go well, as the paras were scattered over a wide area. They found themselves in amongst the US 1st Infantry Division, so the small force had to fight its way back to their own lines. The failure of this small but significant action would help to delay the advance of the SSR. Dietrich's men had Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper at their head. This SS officer was a seasoned veteran of Russia and Normandy. He had a battalion of 45 King Tigers under his command, but in the opening stages they were not with the lead force. He helped to ensure that the advance got off to a good start towards the Elsenborn Ridge under the cover of the bad weather. However, the Americans gave a good account of themselves and succeeded in preventing the Germans from taking this vital high ground. Slightly south of here, the main body of the 1st SS Panzer Division moved into the gap that had been opened up between the US 5th and 8th Corps. The route of their advance was towards Honsfield, which they reached on the following day. Various delays had taken place, but by the end of day 1, progress had been made. In the 5th Panzer Army's area, the advance got under a good start. They moved against the thinly spread American units and forced through the enemy positions. Some of the American forces slowed the advance and managed to hold some of the bridges in the area. By the end of day 1, however, crossings had been made over the Our River and the German panzers rolled on towards Clairvaux. Further south, the 7th Army ran into similar difficulties to Dietrich. The ground was favorable to the defender, and Brandenburger's men made little headway.
Deal of confusion reigned for the first day or so, but after that the plan began to fall apart, partly because once the initial surprise was overcome, American soldiers stood and fought, and this slowed the German advance down, especially in key areas. The roads proved as difficult to negotiate as had been anticipated, slowed down again.
Overall, although difficulties had been encountered, the 17th of December would see the all-important armour committed in strength. However, the American High Command was starting to react to the German attack. Reinforcements were being rushed to the area to meet the threat. Among these reinforcements were the 7th and 10th Armoured Divisions, together with the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. These last two units were ordered to the vital road junction of Bastogne. The German attempt to reach their objective continued. Dietrich in the north was keen to make progress. He moved the 12th SS Panzer Division from their attack on Elsenborn Ridge and pushed them in behind the 1st SS Panzer Division, who were moving towards the Amblève River. The move actually helped to relieve the pressure on the Americans defending the ridge area. This allowed them to catch their breath and set up a defense that the Germans could not breach. Dietrich had an ace up his sleeve in the shape of the 150th Panzer Brigade. This force was under the command of Otto Skorzeny, who is probably best known for his dramatic rescue of Mussolini.
But part of the deception plan, the Germans actually equipped Sikorsky's units with English-speaking Germans wearing American uniforms and driving American vehicles. The idea was to spread confusion amongst the American forces. These units would actually go ahead and capture the fuel supplies, and then the panzer units would refuel and continue their advance towards the Channel ports and towards Antwerp.
They were also to pass false information to the enemy and generally cause confusion. They did have some successes. The most notable was when they reached the Meuse. They were unable to capitalize on this success as the main body of troops were too far behind. Also, groups of them began to get stopped and arrested by the Americans. The rumors quickly spread that there were Germans driving around posing as friendly forces. Everyone became a suspect, and some very high-ranking American officers found themselves in awkward situations. Eisenhower himself was confined to his headquarters for fear of assassination. Although their objectives were not entirely reached, the psychological effect that this unit had was very widespread and out of proportion to the small numbers involved. Most of those that were captured were shot as spies. Piper's advance in the north had come across a group of Americans whom they took prisoner. They were held in a field near the crossroads at Malmedy. It was here that around 80 of them were shot. The Americans claimed that this was in cold blood. The Germans claimed that they were trying to escape. The bodies were found a short time later, and the search went out for the culprits. The story spread throughout the American lines and actually helped to instill resistance in the men. Just before this incident, Piper's men had succeeded in capturing a fuel dump at Bollingen. This had helped the advance to continue. They reached the bridge at Stavelot, but were held up for a number of hours when they came under attack. The advance into Stavelot did resume the following morning, and the town was captured. The advance continued towards Trois Ponts, close to here were the bridges that cross the Salm and Amblève rivers. These bridges were destroyed by the American defenders as Piper's men approached.
Germans got stopped. They American anti-tank guns. People like Team Cherry was just one anti-tank gun on a corner, and a very narrow corner, a very narrow bend with a railway bridge over the top. The Tiger tank came through under the bridge, got knocked out. That was that route blocked. They went another way, and the Americans blew up the bridges so they couldn't cross the river. The Amblève, for example, that stopped the offence. There was only 5 or 6 roads they could use. Well, as each road got blocked, the offence just petered out.
Piper was forced to move back towards La Glaise. He tried to advance through to Chenot, where another bridge crossed the Amblève, but came under attack from American planes. He decided to set up defences around La Glaise and Stoumont. With the failure of this advance, the main emphasis was shifted to the 5th Panzer Army's sector. They were having better luck against the US 106th Division. However, the US 101st Airborne Division had reached Bastogne and set up all-around defences. They offered such stiff resistance that Manteuffel ordered his forces to bypass the town and continue their advance. This created a bulge within a bulge and would provide a very prickly thorn in the German side.
The Germans couldn't take Bastogne principally because of the Allied generals' reactions. When the offensive began, within a matter of a day or so, Eisenhower, the Allied Supreme Commander, saw how the situation was developing, and he saw that places like Bastogne and a similar town called St. Vith were going to be crucial because they were road junctions. They commanded some key roads going through the fighting area, and so he sent at great speed a very experienced American division, the 101st Airborne Division, to occupy Bastogne.
On the 22nd of December, the Germans went to Bastogne with a white flag and the offer of surrender for the Americans. The garrison commander, General McAuliffe, offered his famous nuts reply. The vital town of Saint-Vith, further north, had fallen to the Germans on the same day. They had been battling around this town for days, and like in other areas, these delays allowed the Americans to build up defenses further back. On the 24th, Manteuffel's forces reached an area just west of Celle. This was to become the furthest point reached by the Germans during this offensive. Christmas Day, 1944, saw the besieged Bastogne coming under increasing pressure from the Germans. They pushed more and more forces into this area in an attempt to eliminate the pocket. Further south, elements of Patton's forces were moving closer, and on Boxing Day they managed to force an opening through the German lines and into Bastogne. This was the beginning of Hitler's Ardennes offensive.
I think that probably the fundamental reason for failure was that Allied troops, American and British troops, after the first confusion and flight, stood their ground and fought. And it was essentially that blunted the Germans. Lots of small firefights where they imposed an hour's delay, 2 hours delay, 3 hours delay upon the attacking forces. This gave the Allied staffs time to move the reinforcements into place, which would ultimately seal off the blockage.
Another significant occurrence around this time was the improvement in the weather. This allowed the Allies to send sorties against the German positions.
Had had the Germans enjoyed the same kind of logistical support and air supremacy that the Allies did, this might well have been a war winner. But as it was probably one of the worst kind of vehicles you can imagine to be in. The skies above it were completely dominated by Allied fighter bombers, and this presented a massive target that made it a lot easier for a fighter bomber to hit, and that was a frequent cause of destruction of these guys.
At L'Église, Piper could see the hopelessness of the situation. His men were receiving a pounding by American artillery and tanks. The Americans fired over 58,000 shells into this area during the battle. This provides a good picture of the punishing fire that Piper's men would have endured. He ordered that the tanks and half-tracks that had not already been destroyed by Allied fire to be destroyed by his own men to prevent their use by the enemy. They were out of vital fuel and ammunition. He left some of his men behind to give the impression that they were still battling, and also to look after the 150 American prisoners that they had captured. He took the remaining 800 survivors with him and made for German-held lines. Piper managed to reach these lines a few days later. The escape attempt had been dangerous, and on more than one occasion his men became involved in firefights with American forces that were moving across Piper's escape route. Piper not only left behind some of his men, he also left behind an impressive bag of irreplaceable armored vehicles that included 6 King Tigers, 13 Panthers, 6 Panzer IVs, and over 50 other vehicles, including around 45 armored half-tracks. These losses were hard to take at this stage of the war. Further south, the corridor into Bastogne was slowly widened. Ferocious battles took place around this area, and both sides fought desperately for control. The Americans pushed more and more forces into the Bastogne area. The Battle of the Bulge, as the Americans called the battle, was proving a very hard fight for both sides. As the Allies were able to push more forces into the area, they slowly succeeded in pushing the Germans back. By the 2nd of January 1945, the front line had been reduced by around 15 kilometers. Although the Ardennes offensive is always associated with American forces, the British forces also played a vital role. In the early stages of the offensive, Montgomery had recognized the importance of the River Meuse to the Germans and had placed strong British forces in a defensive position along the northern sector. He was also given command of some of the American forces. This in itself caused a rift between the Allies and in some respects almost helped Hitler to achieve his goal. When the time was right, Montgomery launched a counterattack into the German lines with the objective of linking with the Americans further south. This objective was finally reached on the 4th of January at the town of La Roche. What this meant was that a solid defensive line now existed that the Germans could not hope to penetrate. Also, the River Meuse, that was vital to German success, was now out of reach. Hitler still ordered the advance to continue and achieve the original objective, but at this stage this was an increasingly impossible task. The intensity of the battle is best described by Patton himself, who on the 6th of January expressed his very real fears that the war could still be lost by the Allies. The 1st SS Panzer Division were moved down to this area to help destroy the Americans at the end of December. This did nothing to change the final outcome and only added to the German casualty list. The Allied fighters flew sortie after sortie against the Germans and inflicted further aerial destruction on the increasingly pressurized German forces. The Luftwaffe launched their own attacks around the start of January, when around 1,000 planes flew against Allied targets. This attack had some notable successes, including the destruction of 300 Allied aircraft and the damage to around 25 Allied airfields. Around the middle of January, some of the German units were withdrawn, including the 1st SS Panzer Division. This put even more pressure on the remaining German forces. Hitler had also launched another, smaller offensive called Nordwind in January. It had the objective of destroying the Allied positions around the Vosges Mountains. The attacks quickly bogged down against the Allied defenders, but fighting did continue until the middle of January. The operation itself achieved nothing of any significance, but it represented a high, irreplaceable cost to the Germans in men and machines.
The aftermath of the offensive was that the battlefield was covered with abandoned German tanks, left by the crews because they'd run out of fuel, either destroyed by the crews themselves or destroyed by Allied tanks or by Allied air power.
By the end of January, the front line was back to where it had been at the start of the German offensive 6 weeks earlier. The loss of the Ardennes offensive removed any reserves that the Germans possessed and that could have been used in the defense of the Reich. In the east, the Russians had launched their new offensive in January 1945. There was nothing available to counter this threat. Hitler's last gamble in the west had failed completely. The end of the Third Reich was in sight.